indeed for inviting me.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Are you going to show my
Yes, sure.
presentation?
Yeah, I will show. You see it, right?
Yes. We need to start from the beginning.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, could you turn on the next slide, please?
Sure, sure.
My presentation today is about the proof and reasons why Starling's law for the capillary interstitial fluid transfer is wrong, advancing the hydrodynamics of a porous orifice tube. The authors are Khalid Ghanem and myself, Ahmed Ghanem. I am the presenter today. Excuse me just a minute. I am alone and I have to open the door for somebody.
Okay, sure.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Next slide, please.
Yes.
In 1986, Starling proposed a hypothesis for the capillary interstitial fluid transfer. The capillary was thought a tube of uniform diameter that is impermeable to plasma proteins. The flow of fluid across its wall was thought dependent upon a balance between the hydrostatic pressure within its lumen, causing filtration, the osmotic pressure of plasma protein, causing absorption. At the arterial end of the capillary, the lumen pressure was thought greater than the oncotic pressure, and the fluid is pushed out. At the venous end, osmotic pressure is higher than the hydrostatic pressure, and the fluid is withdrawn into the capillary lumen. The physical basis on which the hydrostatic pressure of a capillary was thought positive and responsible for filtration was Boisille's work on long brass tubes of uniform diameters. However, Bernoulli's effect of a fluid jet and Venturi's effect of a tube constriction are well known. Starling's hypothesis has undergone extensive evolution to become a law prior to the discovery of capillary ultrastructure, namely the pre-capillary sphincter and the porous wall that allows the passage of plasma proteins. The osmotic chemical composition of body fluids is identical to the plasma. The negative pressure of the interstitial fluid space is negative. Inadequacy in explaining the capillary ISF transfer in many parts of the body, particularly the vital organs, has previously called for reconsideration of Starling's hypothesis. In 1984, clinical observation consistent with Starling's hypothesis prompted physics and clinical studies to verify the hydrostatic pressure, the fluid dynamics in a porous orifice G tube, with reference to the effect of the pre-capillary sphincter, arterial and venous pressure on the capillary interstitial fluid transfer. The observation was during a hypotension shock, in which prompt and adequate vascular expansion for resuscitation, all fluid leaks into and drown the interstitial fluid space and filled the potential body cavities as demonstrated in post-mortem examination. This observation augmented with another that although arterial hypertension is very common, it does not cause edema. posed the question, if hydrostatic pressure is a filtering force in the capillary, how come such massive fluid was filtered into the interstitial fluid space during hypotension? If hydrostatic pressure truly responsible for filtration, and if not, what is? If Dr. Starling had based his hypothesis on Boazili's physical experiments, similar studies on tubes built on a scale to the capillary altar structure, namely the porous orifice tube, should answer the question. Folco and Neal stated that the greatest discovery in medical science was made by William Harvey, who showed in 1628 that the heart pumped the blood around the circulatory system and understood that the circulation provided nourishment for the tissues. 4 centuries earlier, however, Ibn Nafis discovered the pulmonary circulation. Both systemic and pulmonary circulation exist to provide for tissues viability. In 1886, Starling proposed his hypothesis for the capillary interstitial fluid exchange. It was based on 2 known physical opposing forces, the hydrostatic pressure based on Boazili's tube as filtration force, the oncotic pressure as absorption force. In 1929, Landis measured hydrostatic pressure of a capillary by a cannula facing upstream, which was 32 and 12 millimeter Hg at the arterial and venous ends, respectively. In 1948, Babenheimer and Soto Rivera studied the quantitative changes in the weight of the isolated hind limbs of dogs induced by alteration of arterial and venous pressure. Edema was induced by increasing the venous pressure in order to match any increase in arterial pressure. Such isogravimetric state in which the capillary filtration exceeds the absorption, as would be expected with high venous pressure, was thought in support of Starling's hypothesis. The author also found that the osmotic pressure of concentrated plasma solution was 23 to 28 millimeter Hg in vitro. Ever since, most physiologists have accepted Starling's hypothesis as a physiological law. However, most of the enlightening scientific evidence on microcirculation started to appear decades later. In 1960, Mallender showed that interstitial fluid absorption increased after autonomic stimulation. In 1962, Hendry measured the oncotic pressure of various body fluids and found it identical to that of the plasma. In 1963, Guyton and Coleman measured the interstitial fluid tissue pressure using an implanted perforating capsule and found it has a negative value of -7 centimeter water. In 1967, Rodin showed that the capillary tube is encircled by a cuff of smooth muscle fibers at its arteriolar junction, named the precapillary sphincter. Also in 1967, Karnowski showed that the capillary wall is made of flat cells and their intercellular junctions are slits of 10 to 20 nanometer wide, which are the pores through which fluids, nutrient, and protein molecule pass freely. His photographs shows the stained horseradish globules, which are much larger than plasma protein molecules, passing through these pores. The finding concerning plasma proteins and the capillary pores alone has cancelled the absorption force of oncotic pressure in Starling's hypothesis. In 1982, Keel, Neal, and Jolt pointed out that the concentration of tissue proteins in the liver, lung, and the muscles is 60% that of the plasma. In the pulmonary circulation, the arterial pressure is less than the osmotic pressure, oncotic pressure. Thus, fluid filtration in the lungs and reabsorption in the liver and the muscle lack explanation. The oncotic pressure neither can explain the negative pressure of the interstitial fluid space, nor the speed and efficiency with which the capillary ISF fluid, nutrients, and oxygen transfer occurs. This knowledge in capillary ultrastructure and the permeability to macromolecules prompted Rinkin in 1986 to call for reconsideration of Starling hypothesis, but an alternative mechanism was still evolving at that time, which is reported here. We studied the hydrodynamics of the rubber inlet tube in order to demonstrate the negative side pressure gradient exerted in the wall, as well as the flow pressure component of its lumen pressure. Within the study the hydrodynamic of a porous orifice tube, we called it the G tube, akin to the capillary. The G tube was enclosed in a chamber C, akin to the interstitial fluid space. This makes the GC apparatus demonstrating the GC circulation phenomenon, as I shall show in a minute. The factors affecting the speed and efficiency of the GC circulation were evaluated. This included the proximal pressure, the distal pressure, and the inlet diameter. The GC apparatus was enclosed in a circulating model driven by electrical pump and connected to manometers. This first graph shows a rubber tube with a narrow inlet, demonstrating the negative side pressure exerted on its wall through manometers connected to a jar 300 millimeters below the level of the tube. It shows suction of red fluid into the tube. This figure completes the negative pressure gradient along the wall of the G tube by turning into positive pressure towards the exit, leaking water, while absorption occurs in the proximal part as shown in the previous graph, and this creates a circulating magnetic field-like field around the tube. This is to contrast with this Boisille's tube, in which the hydrostatic side pressure is higher near the inlet and lower near the exit. This diagram represents the forces that operates and creates the magnetic field-like circulation around the G tube. Number one is the proximal pressure pushing the fluid through the G tube to come out at 6 against distal hydrostatic pressure. This creates a negative pressure causing suction at 3 and a positive pressure causing filtration at 4, creating the hydrodynamic magnetic field-like circulation at 5 with a net negative pressure in a chamber C at 7. This is to demonstrate the negative pressure in the surrounding chamber around the G tube by demonstrating suction of red fluid into manometers connected to the chamber near the inlet and near the exit. Figure 5 demonstrates in another way how the negative pressure in a chamber around the G tube is negative by sucking a membranous chamber in. It is collapsing on the tube rather than ballooning out if it was a positive pressure. This is the GC apparatus here, connected in a circulatory model driven by electric pump, demonstrating a proximal pressure above 70 centimeters in this red tube and a distal pressure of 7 centimeters behind this blue tube, and the pressure in the chamber is negative of -1 and -2 at inlet and exit, respectively. The same circulatory model without adding the inlet, which is the narrow inlet to the tube. This is a Boisille's tube with positive pressure in the proximal end, and the pressure in the chamber are positive, higher near the inlet, lower near the exit, and the distal pressure is lowest. So the flow in the chamber is the same direction as the flow in the G tube. Well, exactly opposite of what happens in the G-tube. Here is to demonstrate the direction flow in the G-tube. These 4 photographs were taken in a sequence. Injecting ink at the distal end of the chamber shows it to move towards the proximal end, and when the injection ceases, it clears up very quickly by absorption at the end, which is in the opposite direction to the flow in the circulatory model and in the G-tube. This demonstrates the relation between the diameter of the inlet versus the side pressure and the chamber pressure. It is a bell-shaped curve with maximum negativity at 0.7 inlet diameter in relation to the tube diameter, which is equivalent to 0.5 surface area. This demonstrates the relation between the distal pressure to the side pressure and the chamber pressure. It shows that increasing the distal pressure reverts the side pressure and the chamber pressure from negative to positive, and it goes higher as the distal pressure goes higher. Next, please. We missed one figure. Results demonstrate that the hydrodynamic of the G-tube are different to Hagen-Boisille's tube. In flow, proximal pressure induces a flow jet with lumen pressure inside both the G-tube and Boisille's tube, which has the dynamic flow pressure and the side pressure component. In the G-tube, the net effect is negative side pressure gradient, causing suction as shown in figure 1, but in Boisille's tube, it induces filtration all along the tube. This challenges the role attributed to arterial pressure as filtration force as proposed by Starling. The major difference between Boisille's tube and the G-tube is that the first induces all positive energy pressure gradient, which can only cause filtration. Hence, it requires another force for reabsorption. The G-tube has both its positive and negative pressure component, which autonomously induce both filtration, as shown in figure 2, and absorption, shown in figure 1. This induces the GC circulation phenomenon, shown in figure 3, and the net negative chamber pressure in a surrounding fluid chamber, as shown in figure 4 and 5. Results of studies on the G-tube would make sense when linked to its physiological equivalence. Proximal pressure is akin to arterial pressure, induces a flow jet with its lumen pressure component. The negative side pressure component occurs maximally over the proximal part of the G-tube and is mainly responsible for suction akin to absorption. Filtration occurs autonomously over the distal part of the G-tube, as shown in figure 2. Both effects induce the GC circulation phenomenon shown in figure 3. Side pressure also induces a net negative pressure in chamber C, demonstrated by the caving in of a membrane cover. The direction of flow in the chamber C is in the opposite direction of the flow inside the G-tube, with a net negative chamber pressure akin to the negative pressure of the interstitial fluid space. Fluid comes out autonomously through the distal holes of the G-tube. It is greatly augmented by increasing the outflow distal pressure, akin to elevating central venous pressure, augmenting filtration, and causing interstitial fluid shift or edema. The GC circulation phenomena causes rapid mixing of fluid inside the lumen of the G-tube and the surrounding fluid chamber compartment C, as shown in figure 3. Its efficacy in its exchanging material between the G-tube and the chamber C, akin to the capillary interstitial fluid compartment, is remarkable. The negative energy force effectively irrigates chamber C allowing rapid transfer of fluid and particles into and from the chamber C, akin to the passage of fluid with oxygen and nutrients, including protein molecule, into the interstitial fluid space and washing out waste products while preventing excess interstitial fluid accumulation. Guyton and Coleman's capsule measure the negative pressure of the interstitial fluid space under the skin by the dynamic capillary flow and demonstrated the net negative chamber pressure in the GC apparatus, figure 3, 4, and 5. Hydrodynamic study on the porous orifice G tube based on capillary ultrastructure demonstrate results which differ from Boazili's tubes, straight tube with uniform diameter, hence it challenge the role attributed to arterial pressure as filtration force in Starling's law. A prospective literature review shows that the oncotic pressure force has been previously cancelled and the law has failed to explain the capillary interstitial fluid transfer in most parts of the body. A concept based on the new hydrodynamic phenomena is proposed for the capillary interstitial fluid circulation. It explains this vital circulation in every organ and tissue of the body. A rapid autonomous dynamic magnetic field-like fluid GC circulation occurs between fluid in the G-tube's lumen and the surrounding fluid compartment at sea. The presented evidence does not only prove that Starling's law is wrong, but also provide the correct replacement, namely the hydrodynamic of the G-tube, explaining the capillary interstitial fluid circulation. This diagram should replace Starling's law in every future physiology textbook, and it explains how the circulation between the capillary and the interstitial fluid occurs. Thank you for listening.
So thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for your presentation. If there's any questions,